Okay, we're back. Okay, do we have audio? Do we have audio? Anybody there? Okay, do we have audio? Oh, I see somebody's already said yes. Good. Okay, I have really a lot of trouble with this YouTube interface. Maybe it's just my old boomer mind. I can't wrap myself around it, but they jump you from screen to screen trying to find the edit button, and in the end, everything gets locked up. And I had to completely restart the browser. And now it seems to be working great. Although I think we got that lag back. Yes. Okay. We have an annoying lag. Okay, we got a few people showing up. We'll wait a minute or two. I'm not going to try and correct this lag. I have no idea what's going on here. Oh, seems to have gone. Okay. It's in sync again, or close to it. Give it another 2-3 minutes. See if more people find the new link. We had about 15 people on before. Now it's 6. I've got to talk to somebody who knows it, who uses this this YouTube live streaming for a while and understands it. They got 8 people on now. Maybe we'll start when we get up to, if we get up to 10, or if it's another 2 or 3 minutes anyway. Okay, good. Oh, now we got the lag back. Yeah. I guess that can't be helped. Okay, so let's get started. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about death and rebirth, and how this process is understood, in particularly in Theravada Buddhism. This is birth and death is the existential dilemma, and it's called, in the Zen tradition, it's called the great matter, or the big question. And certainly when the Buddha set out on his quest for awakening, he was moved by the reality of birth, sickness, old age, and death, seeking to transcend those factors, which are inherent in human existence, and birth and death are inherent in all modes of existence. There are no immortal beings in Buddhism. The Dewas have very, very long lifespans compared to humans, but eventually they pass away from there. Death is the end of a life continuum. When you're born into any state of existence, you have a certain amount of time in that existence, and then when it ends, that continuity ceases. The aggregates fall away and they disperse. And we all know we're all going to die. We don't know when or how or where. And we really have no direct knowledge of what happens at the moment of death and afterwards. Even though we've been through it many, many times before, we normally don't have any memory of it. There is as you're mostly probably all aware, there is in Tibetan Buddhism quite a study, a science of death and the stages leading up to death and the experience of the being after death in what they call the bardo, or the intermediate state. In Tibetan Buddhism, won't go into too much detail, but there's a general idea. When a being is dying, the various faculties fall away in a specific order, and this is actually paralleled by the process of falling asleep. So it's one of the benefits of trying to fall asleep mindfully, to meditate into the sleep states, is that one has a rehearsal, as it were, for the death process. And it's said in Tibetan Buddhism, it's said that at the moment of death, there is a brilliant white light, and it's only very briefly there. And if you have enough mindfulness, you're spiritually advanced enough, you can go into the bright light. And this is the equivalent to awakening. But if you miss the bright light, which normally beings are confused and driven by their old karma and desires at the moment of death, then you'll see a series of lesser lights of different colors. And these represent the different realms of rebirth, and you'll be drawn into one or the other. And there's a whole sequence of events that happen to the being in the intermediate state before they arise in their new becoming. Now, in Theravada Buddhism, there's never been a detailed description of the intermediate state. And in fact, there is a considerable controversy as to whether one exists at all. In the later formalized Theravada, what I've sometimes half-jokingly referred to as High Church Theravada, which is represented by the commentaries in the Visuddhimagga and to some degree the Abhidhamma, there is actually no intermediate state allowed. The death moment is followed immediately by the rebirth moment. Now, the reason this is controversial, there's two reasons why this is controverted. One is the almost universal belief in Theravada Buddhist countries that there is some kind of intermediate belief, intermediate existence. This is in what we might call folk Buddhism or common Buddhism. I think it's generally believed in Thailand that most people experience at least a short period of time in the ghost realm as a peta before they take their proper rebirth. And I have heard, I can't vouch for this firsthand, but I have heard that in at least in some parts of Burma, it's commonly believed that people become birds after death for a short time before they reborn as humans. The other reason for having some doubt about birth moment following immediately upon death moment is some hints in the suttas themselves. One is a passage in the Anguttara Nikaya that talks about different classes or grades of anagamis, that is, person in the third stage of awakening, of almost arahants. And the classification is into different kinds according to when they finally become arahants. And some of them become arahants pretty quickly in their next existence. Some of them go through all the pure lands before becoming an arahant. And there's one class of anagami that is said to attain arahantship in the interval, and it's not explained what in the interval means. But it would seem to imply that there is an interval between death and rebirth, that it isn't instantaneous. The other scriptural source that sheds some doubt on the idea of an instantaneous rebirth is the description of what occurs at the beginning of a new human birth. It's said that the new continuum, the new human birth, begins at the moment when three things come together. The seed of the father, the mother in her season, meaning she's in the right part of her cycle, menstrual cycle, and the third factor is the Gandhabba seeking rebirth. And this is again not explained at all in the original text, and there's been a number of studies done into what exactly is being talked about here. Gandhabba is a very curious word, the Gandhabba seeking rebirth. In the broader context of the suttas in general, there are three seemingly disparate contexts in which the word Gandhabba is used. One is what we have just referenced, the Gandhabba seeking rebirth. And another is a class of lesser devas that are the heavenly musicians. The most well-known of these is Matali, who also served as Sakka's charioteer. The Gandhabas are somewhat to be considered the male equivalents of the Acharas, the female dancing girls. These are the two lower class of devas that serve as the entertainment, in heaven, the singers and dancers. But if you just make it in the door to heaven, you just barely have enough karma to make it into heaven, you'll be in the entertainers. So this is a Gandhabba as Gandhabba seeking rebirth, and Gandhabba as a heavenly musician. And the third class is found in a short series of suttas in the Samyutta, about Gandhabbas as being a kind of being that flies around in forest places and feeds on scents, that is, odors, such as the odors of flowers, the odors of trees, and so on, feeding on scents. So these seem quite inconsistent with each other, and it adds to the confusion. In the Sarvastivadan text, the Abhidharma Kosha, there's a description of Gandharvas, that is the Sanskrit equivalent of a Gandhabba. A Gandharva, which unifies at least two of these concepts. And it's there stated explicitly that when a person dies, they become a Gandharva for a short time. So this is also somewhat analogous to the folk belief that they become birds, right? The Gandharvas fly around seeking their place of rebirth, and in the meantime, they live off the odors of flowers and other scents. And they find their place of rebirth, and they are attracted to it. And it's said that when they observe, and this is you're talking about human rebirth. We can mention a little bit about other kinds, but being taken a human rebirth, they're attracted to the couple that are going to become their parents in the act of copulation. And if the being is still in the sense desire mode of consciousness, they'll find themselves excited and attracted by this. And if their attraction is towards the female, then they'll become born as a male. If their attraction is towards the male, they'll become reborn as a female. So this scheme also finds its way into the broader Tibetan picture. In the Theravada texts, in the Visuddhimagga, there's a description of the death process in very technical Abhidharma terms, and it's stated there that when one gets close to death, the consciousness before the immediate death consciousness, the consciousness is the sequence of consciousness will alight on a sign of karma or sign of destiny. That is sign of karma, that they will have a strong recollection of past karma that may be a karma made in a previous lifetime that will be the decisive karma for their subsequent rebirth. Sign of destiny means that they will have some vision of the life to come. If they're going to be born in the Deva realm, they will see gardens and parks and beautiful trees and flowers. If they're going to be reborn in the Hell realm, they'll see fire and swords. I spoke to a woman once who worked as a nurse in a terminal ward where people were dying. She saw, over the course of years, she saw many people dying, probably a few hundred. And she was a Buddhist lady. And I talked to her about it, and she said that she noticed that there's a big difference in people's demeanor as they approach death. And she was knowledgeable enough to attribute this to the sign of destiny. She said some people are, as they get very close to death, they become very peaceful and joyous and happy, and content. They're not in any struggle. Their consciousness and their physical demeanor is not in any sense struggling or anxious. And there are other people who become absolutely terrified and who clutch on to any shred of life, and they're completely distraught and um, actually overcome by terror. And she thinks that these two classes of people are seeing different signs of destiny. It is the karma made that determines the station of rebirth and the exact situation of rebirth. And karma made the mind state at the end, what the mind dwells on at the end, is very critical because it has a decisive influence. If the mind is dwelling on negative things, there'll be a tendency to take a worse rebirth. So it's good advice if you're around dying people to try not to exhibit signs of distress and crying and so on, but to try and be cheerful. And if you can remind them of good deeds that they've done or happy times that they've experienced, to try and keep their mind at the end in a positive frame, that it's helpful. Somebody asked me once, it was a young fellow, he says his grandfather was dying, and he wanted to know if I thought it would be a good idea for him to sit by his grandfather's bedside and read aloud from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And I said, well, what was your grandfather's religious background? And he said, well, he's sort of an indifferent Christian. Does he know anything about Buddhism? No, he never took any interest in it. Well, then don't read the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It'll just be weird. It'll just be weird stuff for him. He won't, it'll just probably frighten him and not at all be helpful for him. But if someone does have a connection with Buddhism, chanting at their bedside can be helpful, or speaking about the Dhamma. I don't think there's much point in trying a deathbed conversion on people. It's going to be confusing and frightening to them. If they have another religious background and they really relate, say, to Christian symbolism, then help them with that. And then pictures and symbols that they can relate to as spiritually uplifting. If you want to try and get the mind at close to death to be dwelling on the wholesome. When preparing for our own death, which we're all going to come to at some point, some of us sooner and some of us later, but all of us for certain, you have to remember that during the death process, as the body begins to fall away, the mind will fall away too, and it'll be very confusing and painful. And that's not the time that you're going to be able to establish yourself in any positive frame of mind if you haven't been working on it all through your life. You can't start, you neglect your practice for 70 years and then on your deathbed say, well, I'm going to start meditating now. No, that's not going to work. That's completely idle speculation. But if you have some practice and familiarity with meditation through your life, then you can maintain some degree of mindfulness at death. And it's considered to be a very good death and a very good blessing if you're able to die mindfully, unconfused, dying unconfused. That's said to be one of the benefits of metta meditation, by the way, that when you die unconfused. So then the after death and whatever intermediate state there may be, which, as I said, is a question that's really unresolved. Uh, then there is rebirth, which is some new category of being. And this is determined by your karma, not just your karma in this life, but your accumulated karma. Because there are some stations of rebirth, such as in the Naraya, the hell realms, where you have very little or none opportunity to make new karma. You're just experiencing old karma. So when you die from there, then the being is reborn according to some old karma that from previous lifetimes that they've accumulated. We all have a vast storehouse of old karma. So this is how beings actually get out of Naraya. And it's the same in the opposite direction for Dewas, that a Dewa can live for a very long time. They have some opportunity to make karma, but very little, and they usually just fritter away their time in sensual indulgence. The normal life of a Dewa is just party around the clock. And when their time ends, then it's previous karma that they've made determines where they're going to be born. And it's generally easier to fall to a lower state than it is to rise to a higher state. This is made clear in the Samyutta Nikaya that talks about the different realms of rebirth as it's always said to be very many. It goes through the different realms and it says, for example, for a human being, many are the human beings who fall to the Peta or animal or hell realm. Few are the human beings who rise to the Deva realm. So it's like samsara is sort of a pyramidal structure, vaster numbers at the bottom, relative few at the top. So taking a human rebirth is actually considered a very rare and precious thing. And it's not an opportunity to be missed because you don't know where the wheel is going to end up the next time it's spun. So you should take advantage of this human form while you are occupying it. In terms of birth, there are said to be 4 kinds of birth, or 4 modes of birth. There is moisture-born, egg-born, womb-born, and spontaneous arising. Egg-born is creatures like birds and reptiles that lay eggs. Womb-born are mammals amongst the animals and human beings, and a few other sorts of beings that are born live from the mother without passing through an egg stage. Moisture-born is a indication of primitive biology at the time. It's believed that things like maggots arise in rotten meat spontaneously. Right? They're sort of generated from the moisture of the meat. This was a belief held also in Europe. It was only disproved in I think the 17th century, but there's some confusion if you're not familiar with the terminology, because in Europe that was called spontaneous birth. Right? And spontaneous birth in the Buddhist classification is something entirely different. That's the mode of birth of Dewas. When a Dewa is born, they just appear. They just manifest fully formed clothed and garlanded and with their jewelry and everything, and their palaces there waiting for them, and then they just poof and just appear, and they're ready to go. And the same when they die, they just disappear. They just poof out of existence. Although they do have 5 warning signs that can appear for a dewa that warn them that they're getting close to death. That is, their garlands fade, their garments become wrinkled. Their complexion, they lose the luster of their complexion. They become restless on their seat, and their armpits sweat. So this is what happens to a dewa. This is the equivalent of old age for a dewa, and it only lasts for a brief time. So dewas actually have a horror of taking a human rebirth because of the burden of our biology. The whole deal from birth, sickness, and death that they have in a very attenuated form. It seems like a horror to them for what happens to human beings. It's also, we could say about birth, returning to the human realm of birth, that when they talk about birth in the canon, jati, it's actually referring to what we would call conception, that the new continuum begins at the moment of conception, when, as I said, the 3 things come together. In modern terms, it would be the egg, the sperm, and the arising consciousness from elsewhere. So this is considered the beginning of life, the beginning of a human life is conception. So one implication of that is that abortion would be considered the equivalent of killing or murder. It's absolutely not to be tolerated in Buddhist ethics. It's also instructive in the Visuddhimagga that there's a section about the process that the fetus goes through developing in the womb. And it's quite different conception than the Western idea. Very often you encounter the idea in the West that the period spent in the womb is kind of idyllic. It's sort of the blissful state to be in this oceanic bliss, suspended in the amniotic fluid and in this peaceful, blissful state. And in birth, the physical birth, the emergence from the mother is traumatic. And that's the beginning of troubles. But in the Visuddhimagga, the time in the womb is seen as very painful and unpleasant, uncomfortable, dark and wet and smelly and cramped and subject to all kinds of buffeting and unpleasant experiences coming from the outside. And gives an example: if the mother eats a hot curry, you feel like you're burning up. Yeah. So it's interesting how they had a different view of that than we do at present, or it was commonly believed in the West anyway. Now, one question I should address here, talking about death and rebirth, is if there's ever a list made up of Buddhist FAQs, frequently asked questions, one that's going to come up right at the top of the list is, how can there be rebirth and not self? And and this was something, of course, there was even a question that was asked at the Buddhist time and afterwards, and comes up in the sutras, it comes up in the Milinda Panya in various forms and so on. The real answer to that is that it's a question that's based on a false assumption. By asking that question, there's an implicit idea that there's some continuity of substance within this lifetime, from moment to moment. That there's a consciousness as an entity or a thing that continues moment to moment. This kind of substantialist illusion is the opposite of understanding not-self. If you see the emptiness of every phenomenon, the emptiness of the body and of consciousness, then there isn't really any contradiction. Each consciousness moment is a causal factor in the next consciousness moment. Nothing, as a principle of Abhidhamma, nothing arises without a cause, and nothing arises from a single cause. There's multiple causality, but there is a proximate cause, and the dominant immediate cause of something. And each consciousness moment is a cause for the subsequent consciousness moment. And the sequence that you like knocking down a bunch of dominoes, right? One leading to the other. And the only difference that occurs at death, this continuity continues at death, except now, up till that point in this life, the consciousness has arisen associated with a complex of physical factors, sense organs and the body generally. But at death, that falls away. And all the other mental factors fall away. And consciousness arises again in the next moment, as it were, naked, bereft. It needs to associate itself with name and form again. And this is what happens in the dependent origination, the first stages of dependent origination. From ignorance, there are sankharas, that is karmic formations, and from karmic formations, consciousness, which is patisandhi vijnana, the rebirth linking consciousness. And that's caused and driven by the karma made in the previous life and previous to that. And then that arises at the moment in the womb of conception. And this is the spark for the unfolding of form in the womb. It's namarupa. The embryo takes on shape and form and limbs and organs. And it would not do so if it was not associated with consciousness. So consciousness is present right from the moment of conception. The Buddha specifically denied that there is anything which transmigrates from body to body. When this was presented to him by, there was a monk who misunderstood the Buddha's teaching and said he understood it that consciousness moves from body to body. The Buddha said, that's not so, that's a misrepresentation of my teaching, that's quite wrong, don't spread that around. There's nothing which travels or transmutes from body to body. There's just the arising of consciousness according to the laws of karma. And logically, it must be so. If you start with the principle of causality, that nothing arises without a cause, there's no creation out of nothing. There's no utter randomness or arbitrariness, which is the foundation stone of Buddhist thought. If you start from that premise, then you look at the consciousness moments if you look at them backwards to the first moment at conception, then you have to ask, where did this, what was the previous cause for this consciousness? And since there was no physical base before the egg and sperm came together, it had to be elsewhere. And since consciousness is non-material, it's not really determined or bound by space. It could be anywhere, even in another realm of existence. But the karmic matrix was such for that consciousness that when it arose in an appropriate place. So it was part of a sequence. It follows laws and arises according to a lawful condition in the next place appropriate to it. And at the moment of death, at the other end, after having lived a full life, at the other end of the sequence, what happens in the vast majority of cases, if we leave out the case of arhants, when a being is the last consciousness moment occurs, if it expires in this life, that consciousness is still driven by desire, and it's still subject to karma. So this impulse causes it to arise somewhere else. The root desire of consciousness is always to take an object, to be in a relationship with an object. And it cannot do that without some sort of a base. In the human form, it's a physical base and sense organ. So it immediately arises in another form elsewhere. And whether this could include the idea of an intermediate state, there could be a Peta or a Gandhabba that could be considered as a type of intermediate birth. The being takes this temporary birth as this other form of being before settling on its final form and arising as a human or an animal or a dewa or what have you. But the essential point is there's an unbroken sequence of consciousness moments. But there is nothing substantial that passes from one entity to the other. There's a passage in Melinda Panya talking about rebirth, and King Melinda asks Nagasena, is the being that is reborn, is it the same or different? And Melinda Panya's answer was, neither the same nor different. It's like a man standing across from a canyon, and he shouts and yells, and then he hears the echo coming back. Is that echo his own voice, or is it something utterly different? Well, it's neither the same nor different. In some respects, you could say it's the same. It's his voice. In other respects, it's totally different. That passage is kind of meaningful for me personally because decades ago, when I was just starting to take a serious interest in Buddhism, I read that passage in Melinda Panya, and I happened to be staying in a cabin that was near a river, and the opposite side of the river there was a kind of a low cliff. And if you shouted, you can get an echo. And as soon as I read that passage, I went down to the river, and it was night, the full moon. I went down to the river, and I yelled my name across the river, and I heard it coming back at me. And it sent shivers up my spine. It was kind of spooky, thinking about rebirth as an echo. And I think the best way to think about rebirth, too, just to conclude with a practical point, that people get kind of fascinated with rebirth. And when they begin to take the idea seriously, and they wonder, where was I in a previous life? What did I do? Who was I? What was going on? There's actually very limited value in thinking that way, but because it doesn't matter, in a sense, it's fixed. You're experiencing the karma of that, but you can't change that karma. That's been done. But what is more to the point is to sometimes reflect on this life now that you're presently living, and that at some point this will be a past life. And what kind of karma are you setting up for future becoming? So I'll stop there, and if there's any questions, put them in the chat, and we'll stay on for a while until the questions peter out. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I'm wondering if the chat's also fouled up here. Sometimes it works if I pop the chat out. Okay, here we are. There are some questions. The chat was frozen. We've got it going again. Somebody says, are those in Abhidhamma? I'm not sure what those are you referring to. Could you please say something about anatta? I'm confused regarding interpretations of no self and not self. Yeah, to some degree, that's a semantic question, what you prefer. But I think it does have. It depends. Like different people are trying to emphasize different aspects. Not self is used generally when the writer or the teacher is trying to emphasize a practice-oriented, practical way of looking at every phenomena as not self. So it's like, this is not me, this is not mine, but not making a what would you say, like a metaphysical statement about the generality of not self. But no self is making a metaphysical statement, and it's taking it as a denial or negation of the Upanishadic idea of Atman, An-Atman, or Anatta, not self. This is, from the philosophical point of view, that was what the Buddha was addressing at the time, the idea that there's an imperishable self, essence, and it goes, is generalized into the denial of a swabhava, or a substantial essence in anything. But in terms of a person, this essential essence, just the Atman, it's like an imperishable soul in modern terminology, I guess, or Western terminology. There's this part of a person that never changes, never dies, just carries on. The Buddha denied there's any such thing. Another question. I've heard elsewhere of beings choosing their parents and lives based on pre-life reviews. Is this in Theravada? No, that's not an idea in Buddhism. You don't make a conscious choice. You do make a choice indirectly in the type of karma you make. And there is also an allowance for rebirth by aspiration, which means that there's a sutta talking about this, that if you have an aspiration to be reborn into a certain category of beings, you can develop that aspiration as you make meritorious deeds. So you do a kind or generous act, and you make the aspiration or the wish, may I be reborn into to see the heaven, and that establishes an impulse. But I know what you're talking about here is there's a kind of a view sometimes you see in New Age circles that you kind of choose your birth as this life is sort of like a training academy or a school, and you need to learn certain lessons, and you make a choice about what kind of birth you're going to get. Um, you don't really find that way of thinking in the Buddhist texts at all. Ajahn, could being at peace in the last moments related to Vibhava Tanha? No, it would not be Vibhava Tanha, because you wouldn't be at peace. If you had Vibhava Tanha, which is for people who don't know, that's one of the forms of craving and desire not to be. So if you are going out, if you're dying with a strong wish not to be, to seek annihilation, thinking that death is annihilation is already a wrong view, but then if you're seeking and relishing it, that's a very negative mind state to be dying in, and you'll probably take an unpleasant rebirth because of it. I have a question. If absolutely nothing can last forever, does I don't know what that word is, Kante, spirit or soul of a being, is more than one discourse to see there's unnecessary conditions for Gandhabba to enter the room of Gandhabba in general? I don't understand the first question, and the second one. Is there more than one discourse in the sutras on necessary conditions for Gandhabba to enter the room or Gandhabba in general? Yeah, there's that Gandhabba taking rebirth, that the Gandhabba as the being seeking rebirth, that formula occurs in at least a couple of places in the sutras. And then there's in the Samyutta Nikaya, there's a short section of text on the Gandhabba as a being who lives on flowers and scents. And then the Gandhabba as a heavenly musician is mentioned here and there and developed more in the Jatakas and the commentaries. The best way we can practice to see the three marks and staying attached is this the best way to find the goal in the Nirvana? Yes, that's ultimately the key. Is seeing the three characteristics or three marks, that is dukkha, anicca, anatta, suffering, impermanence, and not self. That's really the whole purpose of Vipassana meditation, is to make that clear. Sorry, I accidentally hit send. My question was, if absolutely nothing can last forever, is there a point where our soul and spirit dies as well? What soul or spirit? What are you talking about? I mean, that's not really a Buddhist concept. In fact, it's a denial of a soul is the anatta doctrine. So it's not, there's nothing there to die. What is the cause for ignorance? The cause for ignorance is the whole process of the dependent origination, but it's I would say primarily it's desire. Desire and ignorance to kind of cause each other. Because we're ignorant, we desire objects because we don't understand the nature of objects. And then because of that desire, we get confused and we become ignorant. So I think it's a kind of a feedback loop. The unchanging unborn, does this remain from life to life? Well, that's a good question. Nibbana is described in the texts uh, either in very poetical terms or if an attempt is made at more exactitude and precision, it's only ever spoken of negatively, saying what it is not. And there's a very famous passage in the Udana, which has a long list of negative attributes: an unchanging, unborn, undying, unformed, uncreated. These are all attributes of Nibbana. So when we say Abana is unborn and uh, not dying, not subject to change or impermanence, um, we're talking about also it being outside of time, akaliko, timeless. It doesn't mean to say that it's unchanging, unborn, undying, does not mean that it's permanent or lasting. If so, then the word Nietzsche would have been used, which means eternal or lasting, which is an abiding in time, in a temporal sense, something that persists forever would be Nietzsche. But something that is never born can never die. And it has no relationship to time. It's outside of time. It's akaliko. It can't really be considered as eternal. It's other than time. Time is a aspect of samsaric or conditioned existence. Bhante, how can someone be truly sure they experience Nibbana since it is awareness, there's no awareness like a blip? Thanks. Yeah, I kind of talked about this a little bit last week. There are various degrees of penetration into Nibbana, and in the Theravada we have a scheme of 4 stages, beginning with stream entry, which is, as you put it, a blip. It's just a parting of the veil, as it were. Oh yeah, okay, there's something else, but it's not fully entered into or understood until the later stages. Whether there's awareness or not is kind of an unanswerable question, because any kind of terminology that we use to describe samsaric conditions and samsaric mind doesn't really apply in Nibbana. It becomes kind of a unanswerable question. Is Gandhabba inclined to enter a specific womb based on the habits of that means kama? In Shinakaya, I seem to be referring to a Devatai being, not someone with Yimnakai. Yes, you're correct. There's, like, as I said in the talk, there's seemingly contradictory uses of Gandhabba in different texts. The only attempt to unify those usages that I found is not even in the Theravada text. It's in the Abhidhamma Kosha, which is our Theravada text. The Gandhabba will be inclined to take birth according to its past karma. Its consciousness arising in that state according to past karma. I can't really elaborate more in a Gandhabba because there's actually very, very little specific information about the Gandhabba. And I think I've covered just about everything there is written about it. Is this just a semantic, or rebirth is something else in the incarnation? Generally, well, they're both English words. Generally, I think Buddhists prefer to say rebirth because reincarnation seems to imply the movement or travel of a soul or an entity from one body to another, whereas rebirth is a sequence of consciousness arising in different locations. And I think it's less prone to if you use rebirth, it's less prone to the self view creeping in. Most valuable birth because at in this existence you have a mixture of pain and pleasure. You have enough pain, and I mean, of course, there's a spectrum of human beings. Some human beings have very miserable lives, some have very blessed and fortunate lives, but generally, human beings have a mix of pleasure and pain. So there's also enough pleasure or respite that there's an opportunity to practice. You have some space. So in the lower realms, beings are overwhelmed by suffering to such a degree that they've got no movement left. They're really unable to do anything about it. And in the higher realms, beings are overwhelmed with pleasure, and it's very hard for them to see that there's any issue or problem. Samsara seems pretty good to me. I've been a Dewa here for 20 million years, and it's pretty chill. Does attaining jhana guarantee a Deva rebirth? No. Attaining jhana is the prerequisite for a Brahma birth, not a Deva birth, because jhana transcends the sensual plane. If you have a mastery of jhana, then you can get entry into the Brahma realm. Do you feel your practice of Dhamma was stronger or more effective when you lived in Thailand or now? It's kind of half of one and 6 of the other. Advantages and disadvantages. I'm certainly very, very glad that I had that experience of going to Thailand. I learned a lot there. That was a very formative experience for me. Is it possible for a human being to enter the tower things to heaven not having attained jhana? Yes. Jhana is not anything to do with the Deva realm. It's Brahma consciousness. How will someone end in only body or only mind realm? That's based on different meditative attainments. The formless jhanas lead to rebirth in the formless realms. And the body-only realm is a very curious thing that the Buddha actually spoke about. Ascetics outside the Buddhist tradition that practiced a form of meditation, but they were convinced that consciousness and perception were the source of all evil. And they practiced a kind of meditation that led to a kind of a stupor where they were anesthetized themselves and they weren't conscious. And they end up getting reborn into this body-only realm. Do you need access concentration for attaining insight? That's a big question. Take a lot to get into the nuances of that. But the short answer is I'll say yes. But there's much more that could be said. In the Brahmajala Sutta, there's a mention about unpercipient beings. Yeah, I've already answered that. Those are the body-only beings. What is the difference between mind and biological brain? Mind is not physical. Mind is a non-physical concept. It's nothing to do with. Well, I won't say it has nothing to do with, because obviously there's some relation point between brain and mind. But brain is physical. Mind is not. And I mean, this is, I think, the big error of modern thinking is materialism. I think it causes a lot of damage, and it creeps into Buddhism. It's really a big error. And the brain is not the cause of mind. If anything, it's the other way around. What must I do not to end in the four lower realms? If you came stream entry, you never have to worry about it. You're never going to go to the lower realm. Otherwise, there's no guarantee. You can live a very virtuous life, and it will greatly reduce your chances. But you may have some old karma from a previous life that you did some evil deed 1,000 years ago, and that may come up. And it's never been the karma's never come up before, and that may come up at the moment of death in your consciousness, and then you'll take a lower rebirth. Okay. And practicing Anapana gain first jhana or stream entry. Yeah, either one, depending on exactly how you're practicing what you're doing. Thank you. Okay, I think we'll call it a day. Again, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning. I'm going to make an effort to try and find somebody to explain this to me, why I keep crashing it out. Yeah, you do need to stick to one object. Very rarely, but I think it does happen. Okay, I'm going to check out. Yeah, bye all.